Mm.
He didn't make it. So it was terrible. He has a 25-year-old son, and it's real hard to, it was also strange being in his house. I've known people who've passed away from COVID. Not many people that are that young, and it was strange being in his house because, like, part of me was thinking, I know it's strange, but part of me was thinking that, like, there was an illness in this house that took, this illness that it's like a nebulous, a more, excuse me, amorphous illness that we hear about and we read about, but it's almost like I felt for a moment that this is really a plague. I mean, I wasn't scared. I mean, maybe a flash in my mind, but like, you're thinking, I'm coming into contact, and Lord knows I've had 50 funerals in the last year and a half that were directly a result of COVID. That was caused death, but it's only people that I've seen, unfortunately, when they're already there, and I wasn't in there for them. I don't think I've been in anybody's homes really. So he lives right around the corner from me. He lives a block and a half away from my house. And I was sitting in his house and I thought to myself, this is a place where, and again, I know I've been in people's homes where someone's had COVID, but not where they've been killed by it. And I almost felt like I'm kind of imagining this is what people felt like when there was other plagues, Black Death or whatever. People felt like this house had been touched by that, and it was almost it was almost a biblical like feeling of, this is what
Evil.
happened. Yeah, it's such a weird. It was
Seems like
such a weird feeling of it almost made it tangible in a way that I hadn't, that I had only kind of felt philosophically or like, intellectually about it. And then I was like, no, this is coming. And I felt like, there should be like a ritual of cleansing for the house, which, I don't, that's my own kind of going into a ritual, a ritual type mode. And, maybe I'll talk to the family about it later, but some kind of ritual of recognizing that this home's been touched by something very powerful and very scary. And anyways, let's hope that.
Rabbi, I have a weird question. I don't know how else to put it, but are funerals back to quote normal?
No,
no, they're not.
They were, and you can still use the chapel, but almost no one is opting for that. They're putting restrictions on how many people can be in the chapel, but more importantly, people are back to, and maybe it'll change again in the next few days. They're going back to people not wanting to congregate together, and basically asking less people to come, and also doing it outside. And unfortunately, at Michael's service, which had a lot of people, there were a lot of people there. It was difficult because people were standing all over the place, and thankfully, again, there were a lot of people that were there. They did do, because Michael had worked at Galpin Ford for 29 years as a salesperson. They had a lot of people from work there, and I don't know who was tending cars that day, but they had people come back. They did have people come back to Galpin afterwards for kind of a Shiva, reception, which people have been doing on and off, not usually at at homes. And what happens is that they have a pretty large area for people to meet in, so it wasn't as it wasn't as problematic as it might be in in somebody's house. But people are what I want to say about Mike's question is that one of the biggest things is not just having a chapel service. I mean, we had a graveside service for my stepfather, Kerry, 3 years ago, or 4 years ago, and it wasn't, we didn't, it was actually last week was the secular yard site of his passing, but we did it outside and we didn't think about it, but we had a Shiva afterwards. One of the things that people have not been able to do for the most part over the last 18 months since last March is to have people into their house and to have a Shiva and to comfort people in their homes. And I have to tell you, I mean, you know, we had the problem with my father last year of not being able to have a Shiva in person. And it's definitely, to me, that's bigger than not having a service in a chapel. That's what I'm trying to say.
Great.
Is that not having the Shiva, to me, is a bigger issue than not having that. And that's a missing piece to this, that of the grieving process that, you know, look, I mean, what are you going to do? It is what it is. I didn't have a choice, but I do think that, that, you know, this, to me, this is when you say normal. Look, I'm going to tell you something, Mike, and I'll tell everybody else this, since Mike's going off of Mike's question. The other night we had Sukkot at our house. On Sunday night, we had our wine and cheese event, which is a chance for people to come together on Sukkot to celebrate. We shake a lulav and etrog. We get to fulfill the mitzvah of eating in the sukkah. And of course, we had Friday night services as well in the sukkah, so it's not like that was the only time. But we had the party at our house on Sunday, and it was obviously the first time in a year and a half that we had a party and people over at our house in a larger group. You know, not to have one or two, and we haven't had many people over. Period. Look, one of the things that we did, which we hadn't done before, which actually we're probably gonna do every time now, is we had the food outside. We had the serving areas outside. We pretty much didn't have people come inside. That was completely because of COVID. It wasn't the weather or anything other than saying, look, we're gonna minimize how much people are inside and people that are inside our home. So that was the decision that we made to that was one thing we did to compensate or to mitigate some safety issues. That was one thing we did. But I will tell you that, you know, part of our concern was, again, how are we going to keep people safe? How are we going to keep our family safe? And so it was a concern. And, you know, it's been a concern of ours for the last few weeks as we've been doing some things for high holidays and for, you know, we've had services 3 other times since June in person. We had services 3 times at the temple, and we've now had services at Valencia United Methodist Church for high holidays, and we had Sukkot, etc. And tonight we have Simchat Torah. So again, for those who feel comfortable and who want to join us in synagogue, we're going to have services or have food at 6, and then the celebration at 7. And it really is supposed to be one of the most joyous times of the year when we start the cycle over. And it's, you know, it's when we finish Deuteronomy and start over in Genesis. But you know, this is still a scary time for us, and a time for us to think about how are we going to celebrate our holidays, but in a safe way and not to jeopardize anybody. Because the worst feeling I'll have is if we know that people get sick. And I'll tell you, now that we're a few days away from Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and probably long enough, the fact that we know that people didn't get sick from our events, you know, I can sleep a little bit better at night knowing that I didn't do something that exposed more people to illness, because that I couldn't abide that myself. Again, when people say, well, why are you doing what you're doing? What's your goal? You know, we want to keep the community together, but if we're responsible for spreading disease, I will take that personally, and it'll be devastating for me to know that I got people sick. So that's not, putting people's lives at risk is not something that you're ever supposed to do in Judaism. And we're not going to do it for the sake of any holiday or anything. We can't put people's lives at risk. So that will not happen. And it is what it is. And we're going to do our best, but those are the operating principles. So that being said, by the way, it kind of fits in nicely with what we're going to read today, because we're reading the book of Joshua, which is about Israel and about the conquest of Canaan, as it's called, or the the coming into Israel of our people. And I have to say, there is an interesting, it's hard for us to read this without thinking of the modern nation of Israel, and to think of Israel's history over the last 73 years since the modern nation of Israel, but even before that, the settling of Israel. And I do want to say at some point, and we'll say it now, but again, if you have the same feelings, that's okay. It's natural. When we read Joshua, it's difficult to separate, as I said, but it's also, again, it's a cautionary lesson to some extent. And it's an opportunity for us to think about what's happened in Israel, specifically to the Palestinians, and again to the conquerors over the last 73 years. And the reason I say that this is an interesting segue to us is that over the last 15, 20 years or 17 years since we've gone to Israel as a community, there are parts of Israel that I won't take people into because of a safety and security issue. So when people say, well, why aren't we going here? Why aren't we going there? I will say, look, there are places that I would go to by myself, but there's other places that I will not take people to because there's a security risk, and I don't want to inflame tensions. And I also don't want to put people in any type of physical danger. So that being said, that's similar to what we feel with the COVID situation, because we have for me, I don't want to do anything that's going to cause people to be endangered. And so keep that in mind as we read this book of Joshua, especially here this week, last week, where we're actually reading about these battles. There are some very eerie similarities. And there are also, even though, again, people there, I will say this again, there are a lot of people who say there is very little historical basis for what we have in the book of Joshua, in the sense that there seems to be more of a like a dream of what happened rather than an actual historical account in the book of Joshua. So just keep that in mind as we're reading this. Those things are going on. There doesn't seem to be actually a lot of historicity, but the belief that these things happen, or wanting to believe these things happen, even in some cases that they're horrific, and that they also have modern consequences. I mean, there are people in Israel who read the book of Joshua as I wouldn't say a manual, but they definitely looked at it as, oh, there's some parallels here. And they used some of the early generals and leaders of Israel's military were very interested in archaeology. One of the most famous is Moshe Dayan, who everyone remembers Moshe Dayan and his eye patch. He was a very, very avid collector and archaeologist, amateur archaeologist, who wound up with several things that he shouldn't have had, in the sense that he had parts of his collection were later on kind of nationalized because they were national treasures. And the other person was a very famous Israeli general named Yigal Yadin, who I would say crossed over from amateur historian archaeologist to a legitimate, very accomplished archaeologist. As you can hear, my dog is very excited by this today. So we're going to share up this, and I'm going to turn this over to our reader. We're in chapter 9 of Joshua. We are reading about the conquest. What we read last week was the conquest of the city of Jericho and the city of Ai. These are two Canaanite cities. So I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to mute right now because this is getting ridiculous. And I'm going to turn it over to Rosemary for a second.
Okay. When all the kings west of the Jordan, in the hill country, in the Shephelah, and along the entire coast of the Mediterranean Sea up to the vicinity of Lebanon, the land of the Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, learned of this, they gathered with one accord to fight against Joshua and Israel.
So you can see that the initial conquests of Jericho and Ai created a situation where the other kings, and that's what they were called. They were kings of these cities, these city states. They start to panic. So all these people, the Hittites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, we lump them together as Canaanites. There doesn't seem to be archaeologically, or like what we can find out from what we know about them, there doesn't seem to really be when the Bible talks about them, there doesn't seem to really be a cultural or ethnic difference to them. More of the regions that these people live. But the bottom line is that these are the inhabitants of the land. Now, at least according to the Bible, they're not the original inhabitants of the land of Canaan, in the sense that they also came in at a certain point. But as we've been told, that time is over. So now we're going to be reading about how one of those groups, one of those Canaanite peoples, decided a different strategy than to fight the Israelites. So here's what happens with Gibeon.
But when the inhabitants of Gibeon learned how Joshua had treated Jericho and Ai, they, for their part, resorted to cunning. They set out in disguise. They took worn-out sacks for their asses and worn-out water skins that were cracked and patched. They had worn-out, patched sandals on their feet and threadbare clothes on their bodies, and all the bread they took as provision was dry and crumbly. And so they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, "We come from a distant land. We propose that you make a pact with us."
So just to explain what they did, in case you didn't catch it, they pretended not to be what they were, which was Canaanites. They pretended to be like them. They pretended to be like Israelites, a group of people traveling and trying to settle in the land. They basically tried to con the Israelites. Now, you already know by the beginning of the story that they're impersonating kind of wandering people. We know that already. But we're going to see the consequences of what they do and how this plays out. So here's what happens.
The men of Israel replied to the Hivites, "But perhaps you live among us. How then can we make a pact with you?" They said to Joshua, "We will be your subjects." But Joshua asked them, "Who are you and where do you come from?" They replied, "Your servants have come from a very distant country because of the fame of the Lord your God, for we heard the report of him, all that he did in Egypt, and of all that he did to the two Amorite kings on the other side of the Jordan, King Sihon of Heshbon and King Og of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth."
So the Israelites seem to be a little suspicious of them. I mean, there seems to be a little bit, really? Where are you from? Where did you say you came from?
Where are you from?
So they said, look, they said all the right things. They said, we're, we come from first of all, they don't really, they're not very specific, like east, west, where is it? It's very distant. But
in another galaxy, far, far away.
Right, it seems a little suspicious, but look, they're now here, they're amongst us. The Israelites even question, how can we make a pact with you? You don't have anything. Where do we get? You're not a city that we can have a pact with. You're like us. How are we going to have a pact? You're living among us. We're all strangers here. So they're a little suspicious even of how would we even have a pact? But of course, the Gibeonites say all the right things. We've heard of God. We heard of what happened here in Jericho, and we even heard of what happened with King Sihon and King Og. We know all about these great things that God is doing for you. And again, it's God. It's what God is doing. They're saying perfect things. So here's what happens.
So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country instructed us as follows: take along provisions for a trip and go to them and say, "We will be your subjects." Come, make a pact with us. This bread of ours, which we took from our houses as provision, was still hot when we set out to come to you, and see how dry and crumbly it has become. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and see how they have cracked. These clothes and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. The men took their word because of their provisions and did not inquire of the Lord. Joshua established friendship with them. He made a pact with them to spare their lives, and the chieftains of the community gave them their oath.
Now, so that they have to show them the stuff because people don't believe them. And well, that proves it. Their little game worked, their ruse works, because they looked at stuff and it says they didn't ask God. They didn't ask God what they were supposed to do.
A little sermon here about relying on evidence instead of revelation.
Exactly. And look, this is an after the fact situation. So the Gibeonites, the pact is in. You can't do anything now. I mean, I'm not going to ruin the story by telling you. They made a pact with them, and now this is what we're going to read about today. The Gibeonites. So Gibeon is a city. I mean, we're going to read. It's the Gibeonites are from Gibeon. It's a place. It means like fortified city. I mean, that's what it means. It's right in the heart of well, today the West Bank, but it's right near Jerusalem. And they do pop up later. Hopefully.
You have a map. Do you have that map?
Yeah, I'm going to pop it up right now. Exactly.
Okay.
I was going to do that. Yeah. So they are going to, I was looking at where it was right now. So, yeah, they are going to pop up later. We actually don't know as much about them as kind of would like to, in the sense that they're when we get to the book of Samuel, they're not actually here on this map, but so this is the map of yeah, it's not here. I will show you on another map. So we're right about here. We're in this called the Southern Campaign. This is called the Southern Campaign or Central Campaign. These are I wouldn't really call a central campaign, though it makes sense for it to be central campaign, because there is one part of the southern area that they take, which is Arad in the book of Joshua we'll read about. But really everything here, is really the whole thing here is really southern. I mean, we don't call it, I've never really seen it called central, but there's a southern and then a northern campaign. But anyways, the point is that I'll show you another map where Gibeon is, but Saul, King Saul, our first king, he decides to how do I say it? He decides to clean house of the Gibeonites during his kingdom. We'll get to it. And he goes on a campaign against the Gibeonites. He basically says, Gibeonites got through before and they shouldn't have. So he decides to wipe them out. So wait, let me put up this. I'm going to put up one picture, which I think is a kind of a cool picture. This is Gibeah right now, and that's Jerusalem in the background. So you can see how close it is to Jerusalem. But it's in the West Bank. I mean, that's where it is today. I mean, that's where it is today. So again, the city decides to save itself. And at least during the time of Joshua, it appears like it's going to work. So he makes a pact, and here's what happens.
But when 3 days had passed after they made this pact with them, they learned that they were neighbors living among them. So the Israelites set out, and on the third day they came to their towns. These towns were Gibeon, Kephirah, Beerot, and Kiriath Jearim. But the Israelites did not attack them, since the chieftains of the community had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. The whole community muttered against the chieftains, but all the chieftains answered the whole community, "We swore to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Therefore, we cannot touch them. This is what we will do to them. We will spare their lives, so that there may be no wrath against us because of the oath that we swore to them." And the chieftains declared concerning them, "They shall live." And they became hewers of wood and drawers of water for the whole community, as the chieftains had decreed concerning them. Joshua summoned them and spoke to them thus: "Why did you deceive us and tell us you lived very far from us, when in fact you live among us? Therefore be accursed. Never shall your descendants cease to be slaves, hewers of wood and drawers of water for the house of my God." But they replied to Joshua, "You see, your servants had heard that the Lord your God had promised to servant Moses to give you the whole land and to wipe out all the inhabitants of the country on your account. So we were in great fear for our lives on your account. That is why we did this thing. And now we are at your mercy. Do with us what you consider right and proper." And he did so. He saved them from being killed by the Israelites. That day, Joshua made them hewers of wood and drawers of water, as they still are, for the community and for the altar of the Lord in the place that he would choose.
So what would you call that? What would you call what happens to the Gibeonites?
They got colonized.
Yeah, and so what they did is they and again, it's kind of strange because they chose this path of not fighting. And I mean, depending on your feeling about this either works out well for them, or they still wind up having to they still have to wind up doing some kind of not quite slave situation, but
Well, then it says they're slaves.
yeah, the word for slave, that I mean, to be an eved,
But if it could be a servant,
indentured servitude, and it seems like it's been clarified, or like the detail on that seems to be that they're not slaves.
it's more like they're a lower caste.
Exactly. That's exactly the word. And so it really seems like they inhabit this situation where they're not slaves and they're not under the authority of people, but they're only allowed to do certain jobs. And so it's much more exactly like the Indian caste system. So it's an interesting situation. And again, I think it bears a certain kind of reflection too on the modern situation. I'm not going to do this a lot. I'm only going to do it. I'm going to do it today. Well, first of all, we're going to be done with this part of Joshua in 2 weeks. Within 2 weeks, we'll be done. But I do want to show you a map right now, this is Gibeah today. So Gibeah is right outside of Jerusalem. This is a map that when you talk about modern day Israel today and talk about like what is happening in the West Bank, this is the Palestinian city of Al-Jib, which is Gibeah. It's the Arabic version of Gibeah. So here's Al-Jib. You can see there's different communities around Al Jib. And that's this area here in the blue, this area and this area and this area. Those are Palestinian areas. The areas that are in the kind of burgundy-ish, reddish areas, these are what we call, some people call them Israeli settlements. Some people call them Jewish settlements. Some people call them, outpost. These aren't outposts, actually. Givat Zev and Har Shmuel and Ramat Alon, these are towns. I mean, these are Israeli towns that are in the West Bank. So Gibeon is an area where there were Israelis who said, we definitely want to live in this area. There were Palestinians already living in this area. And now this area around here, these pockets are Israelis. Now, again, I'm not going to do this a lot because, first of all, it's confusing. It's
Where's the Jordan River?
The Jordan River's over here. Would be
Oh,
over here.
okay. Now I got it.
But here's Jerusalem is right up here. And this is, this is the environs of Jerusalem. I mean, this is the different, this is how far most of us are from Castaic, maybe. Yeah. So it's considered part of Jerusalem government. But what you see is here's a security wall. Here's a wall. Here's a wall. And there's a crossing. There's a crossing. And then my question to you, which you don't have to answer because I have no answer. There's no answer. How will this ever be? How will this ever be situated so that there will be? Unless people, again, at some point just decide they don't want to fight with each other and they don't care about their borders and they don't care about who's governing where. This cannot be a country. Okay, so whatever happens, this, and this as the Palestinian areas, that can't be a country. So again, I'm not going to do that a lot. I'm just doing it with Gibeon because there's a weird connection to what we're reading historically and what is happening there.
No, that makes it interesting. That's like I can see historically where they are and what's happening in today.
Yep. So when people say, why don't we ever go, Rabbi, to Gibeon? I'd like to see what it looks like from, first of all, there's nothing to see archaeologically. You can't, there's some stuff they found from the Roman period. There's like a mikveh there from the Roman period. Look, it was a Jewish city up through the Roman period. There's no question, but it's not today. It's not so easy to say what's Palestinian, what's Israeli today. And there's no way I'm taking people into that situation. It's not like there's fighting going on there right now. Let's make it clear. It's not like people are shooting at each other or anything like that. But the risk of taking people into an area which potentially could have a problem on that day is one that we're not going to go there. But I want you to see that Gibeon is an area today that's contested. It's I don't even know how to describe that map I just showed you. It's not a mess. It's literally like how would anybody say that that's a map of a country or of a national border? It's not. Whatever happens in the future, that situation that I just showed you it's not an easy one to say, hey, I got a solution for you. So anybody who comes in and says, hey, we can do this, we can do that, the solutions are not super easy. I will tell you as an understatement. That's all I can tell you. So it is what it is right now. And that, I mean, I'm just showing you factually what it is on the ground. So that is Gibeon today. And we're now going to read about what some of the other kings did during this period. The other kings of what other Canaanite kings did. This one's interesting here. Well, they're all interesting, but this one, look what city we're in right now. Yep.
When King Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem learned that Joshua had captured Ai and proscribed it, treating Ai and its king as he had treated Jericho and its king, and that moreover, the people of Gibeon had come to terms with Israel and remained among them, he was very frightened. For Gibeon was a large city, like one of the royal cities, in fact, larger than Ai, and all its men were warriors.
Yeah, so Jerusalem sees what Gibeon does, and they're like, what are we going to do now? Because we know what happened to Ai, we know what happened to Jericho, now we know what happened to Gibeon. What do we do? By the way, you see the guy's name is Adoni-Zedek, which means Lord, righteous Lord. That's what it means. But it also shows you that the Canaanites spoke a language that is really not any different than Hebrew. Adoni-Zedek is the same name that you'd have in Hebrew. So he's a Canaanite king. He means righteous king, righteous Lord. And you know, what's he going to do? He's frightened.
So King Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem sent this message to King Hoham of Hebron, King Piram of Yarmut, King Japhia of Lachish, and King Debir of Eglon. Come up and help me defeat Gibeon, for it has come to terms with Joshua and the Israelites.
Okay, so let's just pause right there, right? So rather than go to war against Israel, against Joshua, this guy has this great idea. I'm going to go to war against Gibeon, right? I'm going to go to war against our other people, our other Canaanites, because they made a pact with Israel. So we're going to teach them a lesson, which of course is we can't go to war against the Israelites. We'll go to war against these guys that essentially collaborated with them. Now, look, we don't know that there's any historical basis for this story because we don't have an archaeological basis for this. We've uncovered Gibeon. We know where Gibeon is. We know where this stuff happens. And we do have records of, like we said, Jericho's destruction, which is, about 1,000 years, 900 years before the Bible says it was. But that being said, this is a really powerful story because this is what happens. This is what happens today politically, and this is what happens in countries and in situations where people who are scared and people who are frightened end up attacking their own people. And so there's something powerfully true about what happens here. And again, maybe even though we don't have the archaeological evidence for this, it really is some basis for this kind of story where Canaanites started fighting amongst themselves because they don't know what to do. And it's easier to attack your own people, kill your own people, take out your fear and your anger on your own people rather than attack your enemy. So there's something really powerfully true about this. It's eerily reminiscent of things that we've seen in our own day between countries that we've been at war at or in situations where there is a lot of already political turmoil in a country that's being occupied or that's being at war, that's at war. I mean, this is very real stuff. And I will tell you, there's an eerie similarity to, and again, some people understand that I'm telling you, and I'm not making historical, it's exactly the same parallel, but Palestinians have killed each other over who's collaborating with Israel too much. And Hamas and the PA, which is the PLO, they've gone to war against each other in some at some periods, though, it's been, I mean, they don't like each other, but there have been some times when they've actually killed each other, including most recently where some the PA rounded up some people that they didn't like that were Palestinian and that were pro-Hamas people, and they killed them. And the Palestinians were not happy with their PA authority. So this is sounds eerily similar to some things that are happening right now at this very moment. And again, who knows how it's going to play out, but there's a truth to this that's very frightening. So here's what happens when these kings decide they're gonna deal with the Gibeonites. Here's what happens.
The 5 Amorite kings, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmouth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, with all their armies, joined forces and marched on Gibeon and encamped against it and attacked it. The people of Gibeon thereupon sent this message to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal: "Do not fail your servants. Come up quickly and aid us and deliver us. For all the Amorite kings of the hill country have gathered against us."
Okay, so Gibeon sees these kings coming against them, and they're a powerful city, but they're outnumbered at this point. So let's say they have 2,000, 3,000. I can't remember how many I said it. I don't know if it said how many people were in I, but it says it's larger than I. And you've got 5 kings of other pretty large cities. It's 5 against 1, whatever. They're going to be wiped out. Now the Israelites already know that who they really are. They already know that they've been duped, but they have a pact. They have a pact. So this is a great story because are the Israelites going to honor their word? First of all, to some extent, this is an internal Canaanite problem now, right? These are Canaanites that are dealing with each other, but Israel has a pact with Gibeon. So you can imagine what Joshua's response will be.
So Joshua marched up from Gilgal with his whole fighting force, all the trained warriors. The Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for I will deliver them into your hands. Not one of them shall withstand you." Joshua took them by surprise, marching all night from Gilgal. The Lord threw them into a panic before Israel. Joshua inflicted a crushing defeat on them at Gibeon, pursued them in the direction of the Beth Horon ascent, and harried them all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. While they were fleeing before Israel down the descent from Beth Horon, the Lord hurled huge stones on them from the sky all the way to Azekah, and they perished. More perished from the hailstones than were killed by the Israelite weapons.
Yeah. So
they got a miracle.
Yeah, they got a miracle. I mean, Joshua and the armies did come out against them, but God is even more powerful, and so God intervened. So if this wasn't something that God wanted, God definitely backs them up. So if God isn't happy with what they had done, the pact is the word, and so they're gonna get the full protection. At least now with Joshua fighting, they're gonna get protected. And it says that more of them were killed by the hailstones than by the Israelite weapons. So this is one of the military victories for Joshua, which ironically, and again, here's the weird flip here, was that what should have happened is that Joshua and the army should have gone to war against Gibeon. That's what should have happened, which is one of the reasons why later on King Saul goes, you know what? I got to clear out these Gibeonites who we never should have had a pact with in the first place, which is, look, the story of the Gibeonites is a story of how a Canaanite people wound up living amongst us. And there does seem to be this kind of understanding that this happened. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. And so Saul, to some extent, seems to want to make up for what wasn't done right in the first place. Now, I will tell you this. There might have been a personal reason for, or not a personal reason, but more of a tribal reason for Saul doing what he did, because Gibeon is in the territory of Benjamin, Saul's tribe. So clearing out a city for his own tribe could have been more at stake, more for him than like, let's say, another tribe. Joshua, who's from the tribe of Ephraim, might not have cared that much about the Gibeonite city because it's not going to be in his territory. Now, this will come up in the rest of the book of Joshua. When we're done with the wars, we get up with the division of the lands. Well, if you have a Canaanite city in your midst, maybe you don't like it. So Benjamin definitely has more of a reason. I mean, Saul has more of a reason as a Benjaminite not to want Gibeon to be in his territory. But yeah, it'll be critical in the story of Saul later on, and the story of King David and Saul. Keep that in mind, because the etiological history, which is how these people came into our midst, is important, and you'll be familiar with them later on because they're not going away, the Gibeonites. But again, this is the irony of this tale, which is Israel should have been clearing out the Gibeonites. Instead, they end up fighting for the Gibeonites. So here's what happens.
On that occasion, when the Lord routed the Amorites before the Israelites, Joshua addressed the Lord. He said in the presence of the Israelites, "Stand still, O sun, at Gibeon, O moon, in the valley of Ai-Halon." And the sun stood still and the moon halted, while a nation wreaked judgment on its foes, as it is written in the book of Yashar. Thus the sun halted in mid-heaven and did not press on to set for a whole day, for the Lord fought for Israel. Never before nor since has there ever been such a day when the Lord acted on words spoken by a man.
So Joshua asks for the sun to stand still, not to set, because he wants to continue to fight against the Canaanites, the Amorites here. So he says, he's kind of prays for the sun to stand still, and indeed it does. So this is a miracle. To some extent, it's Joshua's biggest miracle. The other miracles are all, I mean, we read about the Jordan parting. We read about the Jericho, the walls of Jericho. We just read about hailstones. But this is huge because the sun stops. So this is considered one of the it's a pretty powerful miracle. It's a natural miracle that affects, if you think about it, the whole world, in the sense that if the sun stays in its place, then every place in the world is affected by the fact that time just stood still, and the sun stood still, and things aren't, I mean, by the sun standing still, time stands still, and that allows him to continue to, I wouldn't say time stands still. It's not like everyone stopped, but time not moving allows him to continue to fight and continues his ability to wreak havoc. So as long as the sun's up in the sky, he can fight, and it gives him more time to destroy his enemies. So it's a big miracle. It's huge. And as the book of Joshua points out, Joshua asked for it. It wasn't like the miracles that Moses did, where God told Moses, "I'm going to do this miracle. You hold your staff up and this will be what happens." Joshua actually asks for this to happen, and he's given it. So that's pretty significant. That's what it says, the Lord acted on words spoken by man. That's pretty big. There's another thing here that's pretty big, which is this is written in the book of Yashar. We don't have the book of Yashar, folks. There is no book of Yashar in the Bible. We don't have a book of Yashar. It's not there. This is a reference to a book that didn't make it into the Bible. We don't have it. It wasn't canonized, which reminds us that there's books out there we'll probably never get to see because they were destroyed over time and not copied, and nobody felt it was important to copy them down. And so we don't have it. So we know that there's books that the Bible is based on. The Bible just told us that. It just told us it's written in the book of Yashar, which assumes to some extent that somebody who wrote the book of Joshua sat down and had the book of Yashar in front of them and wrote, oh yeah, I want to copy this part from the book of Yashar, which talks about Joshua fighting against the 5 Amorite kings. Yeah, I know it's in the book of Yashar. And they just quoted it. We don't have the book. So this is pretty significant when you read about a reference, and it's not the only place. We've read about the books of the wars of the Lord before as well, which is a book we don't have. There's also a reference to a book called the Books of the Kings of Israel, which we assumed was, for a long time, was the book of Kings. Turns out, probably wasn't. It's probably a separate chronicle that was much more detailed about what the kings did, probably a less theological and more of a regal account chronicle of what the kings did themselves, that the book of Kings and the book of Chronicles used as a source. So this is a pretty significant thing too. Whenever we come to like a source of the Bible that we know existed, it reminds us that there's things, and there were other books too. These are just the ones that were referenced. There were other books too, the history of our people, that we don't have. And more importantly, that they were histories. The book of Joshua and the book of Kings, and they're histories in the sense that they're organized historically, chronologically, telling a story, but their purpose is not to teach history. They were not assembled for that purpose. They were to teach a theological point. They were to talk about God helping us, God punishing us, how to get right with God again. It was not to teach us history. The history is there in little nuggets that we can find, but that wasn't the point of the people who wrote it. Oh, well, the way that they wrote and edited these texts, that was not their point, to teach us history. So keep that in mind too as we read. We're not reading history per se. We're reading people using history to teach a lesson. So what happens here?
Then Joshua, together with all Israel, returned to the camp at Gilgal. Meanwhile, those 5 kings fled and hid in a cave at Makkedah. When it was reported to Joshua that the 5 kings had been found hiding in a cave at Makkedah, Joshua ordered, roll large stones up against the mouth of the cave and post men over it to keep guard over them. But as for the rest of you, don't stop, but press on the heels of your enemies and harass them from the rear. Don't let them reach their towns, for the Lord your God has delivered them into your hands. When Joshua and the Israelites had finished dealing them a deadly blow, they were wiped out, except for some fugitives who escaped into the fortified towns. The whole army returned in safety to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah. Not one so much as snarled at the Israelites. And now Joshua ordered, open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out of the cave to me. This was done. Those 5 kings, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Yarmouth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon were brought out to him from the cave. And when the kings were brought out to Joshua, Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and ordered the army officers who had accompanied him, come forward and place your feet on the necks of these kings. They came forward and placed their feet on their necks. Joshua said to them, Do not be frightened or dismayed. Be firm and resolute, for this is what the Lord is going to do to all the enemies with whom you are at war. After that, Joshua had them put to death and impaled on 5 stakes, and they remained impaled on the stakes until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them taken down from the poles and thrown into the cave in which they had hidden. Large stones were placed over the mouth of the cave, and there they are to this very day. At that time, Joshua captured Makkedah and put it and its king to the sword, proscribing it and every person in it, and leaving none that escaped. And he treated the king of Makkedah as he had treated the king of Jericho. From Makkedah, Joshua proceeded with all Israel to Libnah, and he attacked it. The Lord delivered it and its king into the hands of Israel. They put it and all of people in it to the sword, letting none escape. And he treated its king as he had treated the king of Jericho. From Libnah, Joshua proceeded with all Israel to Lachish. He encamped against it and attacked it.
Now, don't worry, I'm going to show a map in a second so you can see where these victories happen.
The Lord delivered Lachish into the hands of Israel. They captured it on the 2nd day and put it and all the people in it to the sword, just as they had done to Libnah. At that time, King Hiram of Gezer marched to the help of Lachish, but Joshua defeated him and his army, letting none of them escape. From Lachish, Joshua proceeded with all Israel to Eglon. They encamped against it and attacked it. They captured it on the same day and put it to the sword, proscribing all the people that were in it, as they had done to Lachish. From Eglon, Joshua marched with all Israel to Hebron and attacked it. They captured it and put its king and all its towns and all the people that were in it to the sword. He let none escape, proscribing it and all the people in it, just as he had done in the case of Eglon. Joshua and all Israel with him then turned back to Debir and attacked it. He captured it and its king and all its towns. They put them to the sword and proscribed all the people in it. They let none escape, just as they had done to Hebron and as they had done to Libnah and its king, so they did to Debir and its king. Thus, Joshua conquered the whole country, the hill country, the Negev, the Shephelah, and the slopes with all their kings. He let none escape, but prescribed everything it breathed, as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded it. Joshua conquered them from Kadesh Barnea to Gaza, all the land of Goshen, and up to Gibeon. All those kings and their lands were conquered by Joshua at a single stroke, for the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. Then Joshua, with all Israel, returned to the camp at Gilgal.
Yep, that's chapter 10, happily ever after. Everybody's killed. And I will show you a map so that you can see what happened. So and again, as I said, this is usually called the Southern Campaign. I haven't really seen it referred to as Central. It is central. It is Central Israel, in the sense that it is the middle of Israel today. But to call it a Southern Campaign is kind of, a Central Campaign is kind of the way the Bible presents it is it's most definitely a Southern Campaign, because it says what this did is it created a situation so that all the way down, and this is the kind of the southern end here, that this area is now been made free of Canaanites. So he starts out at Gilgal. That's where he crossed. There's the Jordan River. That's where he crossed. There's the Battle of Gibeon, which we read about when these guys all went to war against the Gibeonites. There's Beth Horon and the Ayalon River, which actually goes, as you can see, it goes up to Tel Aviv, goes up to the coast. This is where the battle took place, where he's chasing after him and asks for the sun to stand so that he can go to war. And then this is what we just read, the last part of chapter 10. He goes to Makkedah, Livnah, Lachish, Eglon, Debir, and Hebron. So those cities, as he goes down through them, and you can see, we're not talking about a lot of distance between them. We're talking about, 4 or 5 miles, 5 miles. This is 5 miles. This is probably the longest is about 20 miles from Eglon to Hebron. And then down to Devere, and then back up to Gilgal, which is, again, about 30 miles, 40 miles from Devere to Gilgal.
What would be the theological point of this?
So,
since it's not historically true.
So these cities in the south, especially Hebron, Lachish, pretty much those cities, become really powerful cities during the time of King David, King Saul and King David. And by the way, as you can see, it comes right up to the border of the Philistines, which is interesting because Eglon here is sometimes was a Philistine city and sometimes a Canaanite city. It shows you that the Israelites, at least in the book of Joshua, they're not really dealing with the Philistines. Like the Philistines are either left alone because they can't be dealt with, or Philistines don't care, or it just wasn't part of the history that, I mean, it could conceivably be because the stories are based on pre-Philistine legends or tales, if you will. Look, the point of it, as Revlin's getting, why is this here? It's to explain how the southern kingdom was liberated and made a place where this is all the tribe of Judah. This whole area here is the tribe of Judah. Judah is a huge tribe. And so this is all the way up to Jerusalem, and this area is Benjamin. And then this area up here is going to be the territory of Ephraim. So Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim are the heartland. And again, today, this is the heartland of the West Bank. But at the time, this was the tribe of Judah. So Lachish and Hebron are pretty big cities by the time of King David. David lives in Hebron. He lives. He doesn't live in Lachish, but Lachish becomes one of the important fortified towns that much later on, a few hundred years later on, it's one of the last cities that falls to the Assyrians as they're attacking Judah, the kingdom of Judah, after the north fell. Lachish is mentioned, and we actually see depictions of the capture of Lachish by the Assyrians. They kept a record of their war against Lachish, which was a pretty big city, walled city at that time, 600 years ago. And it's in the British Museum today. You can see the siege of Lachish. So these cities are major cities for Judah. And so the purpose of this is to explain how these cities wound up being liberated, because they're Hebron, to some extent, is the capital of Judah. Bethlehem, Hebron, and Lachish are three of the most important cities in that southern kingdom, and will be, all the way up until the Babylonians destroy them. A few hundred years later, when the Babylonians destroyed these cities, finally, it's pretty bad. These are big cities for the Jewish people. And so the purpose of this is to establish why the southern kingdom benefited, if you will, from Joshua. So if anything, what might be the real purpose then is to explain why Joshua, as a unifying figure, helped everybody. We haven't turned to the north yet, but what it probably did during the time that it was written was to really establish that there is a common history for the Israelites beyond the stories of Genesis, that they were all tribal brothers, that there's a history of them fighting together and a history of them going into battle together against a common enemy. And nothing works better at uniting a people than to have a common enemy. And even though this common enemy is long since gone, the Canaanites, by the time of the Babylonians, nobody talks about Canaanites anymore. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, they don't refer to Canaanites. They're done. They're gone. They've been subsumed by Israel. Have they been completely destroyed by Israel? Well, no. We know Gibeon wasn't, and we know there are other places that weren't as well. We're not reading everything, every battle that happened. We're reading kind of the summary version of it, and the version that gets to the point, which is that God helped us. We followed God's rule. We fought together, and we battled. This is a single country. This is one country with a common history and a common, if we're going to talk about, how do we, unify the United States? Unfortunately, oftentimes we talk about it's when we fight together as a nation. You don't think about it too much until you go to the Civil War monuments where it says this was the Ohio Infantry, and this was the these guys were from the Illinois, battalion. And you can see that even in the north of our country in the Civil War, there was still very much a sense of, well, this is our state, this is our militia, these are the troops that we sent. Eventually after the Civil War, we moved away from that because we realized that even in the North, there was still there's still very much a sense of this is our state. This isn't, we really don't care that much. But it's interesting because you'll see, casualty lists, and they were listed by, they didn't list everyone from the North who got killed. They listed what state they were from. And that was in the North. Forget the South. I mean, we know the Southern states often, fought as state militias. But again, there was a Confederate state, Confederate, army that was, united under Robert E. Lee. So those confederations are sometimes they're strong and sometimes they're not so strong. And you can kind of see when they're not strong by people bending over backwards trying to make them strong. So I will say that there was a sense that Joshua was definitely written with the intent of telling people we have a common history. We fought together and we should fight together to some extent again. So it's really interesting to think about this period because there is not a lot of archaeological evidence for this. People, I mean, I don't want to dwell on this. I already said it, so I don't want to say it over and over again. There is not a lot of archaeological evidence for it. There is more and more as we get closer. There's more and more archaeological evidence for the things that happen, but there is not a lot of archaeological evidence for this. And again, as we get to the Babylonian period, a lot of archaeological, because we have the Assyrian and Babylonian sides of this too. So again, keep that in mind that the purpose of this is to kind of tell us why we have these great cities. But Lachish is definitely one of them. It becomes a Judean city, and it is like Hebron, going to be a very important city. Some of these, by the way, are not important cities today. Like some of these are not, like Gibeon, as I showed you, is inhabited today. Some of these places, they're not. Like, I don't think, like Lachish, I don't know if anybody even, it's basically, there's basically nobody, living. There hasn't really been people living in Lachish since, since the ancient period, which is one of the reasons why there's so much to find, because there wasn't as much, continuous inhabitation. So there's been a lot of digs there. There was one that just was restarted in 2016. And again, I mean, we found a lot of things in Lachish that are historically accurate. We just have not found evidence for this battle that is talked about in the time of Joshua. And it's consistent with the fact we haven't found other things from, this siege, the siege of Joshua. So just keep that in mind. And I'm just trying to find if there's any other pottery that was found. Nope. And I also was trying to find out if we know what the population of it was. But again, some of these places inhabited, some of these places not inhabited today. Oh, Judith just wrote, my sister worked on an archaeological dig at Lachish. So yes, it's been excavated. They did Israel. She could have been part of the 73. There was one in 73 and there was one in 94 at Lachish. And there was one in 2013. And then there's been another one in 2016. So a lot of good stuff they found in Lachish, partly because it hasn't been lived in continuously like places like Jericho. So, or Gibeon, as you saw for that matter. I mean, there's not a lot of people in Gibeon, but it's still underneath people's feet. So we're actually going to finish with this chapter today. We're going to finish with chapter 11. And that'll be our final chapter today.
When the news reached King Yavin of Hazor, he sent messages to King Yabab of Madon, to the king of Shimron, to the king of Akshaf, and to the other kings in the north, in the hill country, in the Arabah south of Kinneret, in the lowlands, and in the district of Dor on the west, to the Canaanites in the east and in the west, to the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, and Jebusites in the hill country, and to the Hivites at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mitzpah.
So the other Canaanites and the rest of the country start to get scared. They are seeing what's happening.
They took the field with all their armies, an enormous host, as numerous as the sands on the seashore, and a vast multitude of horses and chariots. All these kings joined forces. They came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to give battle to Israel. But the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid of them. Tomorrow at this time, I will have them all lying slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots. So Joshua, with all his fighting men, came upon them suddenly at the waters of Merom and pounced upon them. The Lord delivered them into the hands of Israel, and they defeated them and pursued them all the way to Great Sidon and Mizrephoth-Maim, and all the way to the valley of Mitzpeh on the east. They crushed them, letting none escape. And Joshua dealt with them as the Lord had ordered him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots. Joshua then turned back and captured Hazor and put her king to the sword. Hazor was formerly the head of all those kingdoms. They proscribed and put to the sword every person in it. Not a soul survived, and Hazor itself was burned down. Joshua captured all those royal cities and their kings. He put them to the sword. He proscribed them in accordance with the charge of Moses, the servant of the Lord.
Yeah, and Merom is in northern Israel. It's by the Jordan. It's by the Sea of Galilee in the north, and it's a northern battle. And so, what's going to happen here? They're going to go to war there against pretty much everyone else left in all the other powerful kings, Amorite, Canaanite kings. Yeah, this is the northern campaign, if you will. As you can see, not very detailed, but here it is.
However, all those towns that are still standing on their mounds were not burned down by Israel. It was Hazor alone that Joshua burned down. The Israel kept all the spoil and cattle of the rest of those cities as booty, but they cut down their populations with the sword until they exterminated them. They did not spare a soul. Just as the Lord had commanded his servant Moses, so Moses had charged Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Joshua conquered the whole of this region, the hill country of Judah, the Negev, the whole land of Goshen, the Shephelah, the Arabah, and the hill country and coastal plain of Israel, everything from Mount Halak, which ascends to Seir, all the way to Baal Gad in the valley of the Lebanon at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all the kings there and executed them. Joshua waged war with all those kings over a long period. Apart from the Hivites who dwelt in Gibeon, not a single city made terms with the Israelites. All were taken in battle. For it was the Lord's doing to stiffen their hearts to give battle to Israel in order that they might be proscribed without quarter and wiped out as the Lord had commanded Moses. At that time, Joshua went and wiped out the Anakites from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, and Anab, from the entire hill country of Judah, and from the entire hill country of Israel. Joshua proscribed them and their towns. No Anakites remained in the land of the Israelites, but some remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Thus, Joshua conquered the whole country just as the Lord had promised Moses, and Joshua assigned it to Israel to share according to their tribal divisions, and the land had rest from war.
So this is the conquest, if you will. As you can see, the last chapter is all the rest of the country. So we have this southern campaign, if you will, and then the northern campaign is, I don't know, really 17 verses. And as a matter of fact, most of it's just kind of like general what he did. You know, the actual battles are not like which he went to first. Not really, not too much. It talks about Chatzor being destroyed, the city of Chatzor. It basically says that city was actually like destroyed, like Jericho was. It was pulled down and, destroyed. Most of the other cities were not, which means that they are not destroyed, but they are, what's the proper term we use now? Depopulated, right? This is what they did. This is what happened. They literally kill the people. Now, what happens here to some extent is that God does what God does to the Egyptians, which is stiffens their heart and makes them come out and fight, so that it's a fight. It's not just a massacre. I mean, there seems to be this idea that, again, even though we don't know that it happened, we don't want the Israelites to come out like they were just wiping people. People were just throwing down their swords and going, I don't want to fight, or didn't even come out with swords. No, they came out with swords, and then they were destroyed in battle, which is, a little bit, I mean, still says everyone is killed, which is, when it talks about cutting down their populations with a sword, they didn't exterminate, they did not spare a soul. I mean, that's pretty brutal. I mean, there's nothing you can say to that other than, yeah, that's still genocide. This is still people being killed. And it says that the only place that these people survived was if they went to Philistine cities. It actually tells us that, like, the Philistines were there, which, by the way, where am I talking about? Some remain in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Those are Philistine cities. Those are the main Philistine cities, which means that some of them went there, which means that the Israelites didn't go there. They didn't go to Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. They didn't kick out the Philistines. They kicked out the Canaanites. They didn't kick out the Philistines. There's a little hint there that not all of Israel was under Jewish control. The Philistines did not get booted out. Is that because God didn't want them to? Is that because they couldn't deal with them then? The Philistines later on, as we know, become a major thorn in the side of the Israelites. So during the time of the Judges, the next book we read, the Philistines are a major problem. They're a major problem during the time of King David and King Saul. King Saul's fighting the Philistines. They're not easy people to deal with. They're very powerfully militarily. They have chariots and they're fairly strong. And we have excavated some Philistine cities, so we know a little bit about them. Bible tells us a lot about them. Bible tells us that they're Greek originally from the Aegean, which seems to be the case from the archaeology, that's true. And I will tell you what's interesting about this last battle against Hatzor. There does seem to be a fire and destruction at that site around this time. So unlike Jericho stories, and for those who are paying attention, we now have this wonderful story that just came out in Nature magazine about the real story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which there actually now is archaeological evidence that indeed there was a massive destruction, probably from a meteorite that destroyed, based on the archaeology and the geology. There was a major wipeout of people in that area around the valley. If you didn't read this article, it's been all over the internet lately. There's now archaeological evidence that there was a major destruction of people in that area, and that the cities literally, there was a city that had a cataclysmic event that would have literally destroyed everything. People, everything would have caught on fire and been destroyed. So there's these stories that exist. Hatzor was destroyed around this time. Now, here's the weird thing. For people who believe in the Bible as an accurate historical reflection of what happens, the story proves, the archaeology proves the story, that Hatzor is destroyed just as the Bible says it is, and it's singled out that it is, which is interesting. For people who don't like that idea, and they almost try to prove that the Bible isn't historically accurate, there's another possibility, which is that there were Philistine battles at the time, because the Torah, the Bible here is telling us there are Philistines here. There is another operating theory historically that the Philistines went to war against Canaanite peoples, and that there was a major upheaval between the city-states of the Canaanites and the Philistines. And what happened was that the hill peoples, the more Bedouin type peoples, the inhabitants of the area that were not living in those cities, saw what happened to these cities after the Philistines were destroyed, and they came flooding into these now abandoned cities and started living in them. The theory there is that those are our ancestors, that our ancestors are the peoples that that inhabited these places after this destruction, these wars between the Philistines and the Canaanites. Look, that theory kind of makes sense from some standpoint, but it's not, there isn't enough there to say, hey, that makes a lot more sense. But I'm sharing it with you because it is a possibility. And what kind of goes along that possibility is that we really don't have a material shift between the Canaanite pottery and the Israelite pottery, in the sense that the Canaanite Israelite pottery seems to be the same. Now, based on material culture, you'd say, well, they don't seem to be any different. Their language, as we saw, isn't any different. And so the idea that the Israelites were a outgrowth of the Canaanites is a possibility. Now, if that's the case, I'm not advocating that theory, I'm just telling you, it's a theory, and there is possibility that that theory exists. If that's the case, then these battles never happened, and Joshua and Israelites never killed any Canaanites. As a matter of fact, we might have been the Canaanites, the very Canaanites that we say we went to war against. So if that's the case, then there's a very different history that really happened, which is that we became the inhabitants of the land after many of these Canaanite city-states collapsed in their battles with the Philistines. I'm only telling you that this is the theory. There might be an intermediate theory in between them, which is also a possibility, which there were Israelites who flooded into the area, or Egyptian former slaves that flooded into the area during this time and took advantage of some of these stories. But again, as far as destruction of cities, we really only have Chatzor during this time that we could say this happened in the 1200s. This happened in the 1200s. The interesting thing I will only point out is that the Bible says that's the only city that got destroyed. All the other cities, the people got killed, but you could still live in the city. So that's not what the Bible says in the end, of course, which is that Joshua conquered the whole country just as the Lord had promised. And starting next week, we're going to read how they divided it up and what the consequences were for that. So that being said, again, I wouldn't say that that's a happy ending to the story. Lynn J just asked, is there any midrash on Joshua? There definitely is midrash on Joshua, but not a lot. The rabbis really didn't study Joshua a lot. And I think part of the reason why they didn't study Joshua a lot was because they didn't like a story of Jews fighting. They didn't like a story where Jews were going into battle, because the book of Joshua was studied by people like the Maccabees. It was studied by people like the Zealots. It was studied by people who wanted to fight, and the rabbis didn't want people to fight. They didn't like the idea of, they liked the idea that God fought for us, but they didn't like the idea that people would be doing any of that fighting. So that being said, there's not a whole lot of midrash. There's not a whole lot of discussion about Joshua. It's not that Joshua wasn't accepted. He was, but I will tell you that for a long time, Joshua was not a super popular name for Jews. David was, Solomon was, even Saul was. So it's not like Jewish nationalism wasn't still there somewhere in the background, but the guy who actually conquered the land, the name kind of falls out of favor pretty much after the Roman period. So the rabbi, there were Rabbi Yehoshuas. It's not like there were none, but there were a lot more other names for rabbis and and in Jewish history. You just don't see a lot of tombstones for Joshua's.
Did it sound too much like Jesus?
Well, no, that's what you think, right? That is, Jesus's name was Joshua. His name was Josh. He was Joshua. Actually, Jesus is more of the Josh form of Joshua, but it was more of a nickname. But it wasn't really common until later on. I don't think it was because of Jesus. I think based on the lack of discussion about Joshua, it was more that they didn't want people to get all fighty. They didn't want people to get all militaristic and wanting to get up in their militant. Yeah, and so I think they did de-emphasized it, and you just by that after the Roman period, you just don't see many tombs and graves with the name Joshua. So, and again, most of us don't have great grandparents named Joshua. We had Shlomos, we had Menachems, there's a lot of names that were out there, Avrahams, Moshes, all Aharons, all those names, but not a lot of Joshuas. Now we do. Joshua's a popular name now, very popular name now. And it's become a much more common name, but not for most of the last 2,000 years in Jewish history. The militaristic side was not that. And even today, again, there is a certain discomfort, thankfully, that we feel with reading these stories. I will only tell you, based on the archaeology, there's not a whole lot of evidence that this actually happened. So as much as we read it, I always like to tell people, relax. Probably didn't happen. It's a problem, I guess, that we wanted it to happen. That's a little bit of a problem, but it's not as much of a problem maybe as that we actually did it. And that would be hard to live with this. And it is hard for people to read the book of Joshua and not get a little sick to your stomach. If you don't, there's something probably you need to talk about, because this is not even if the Canaanites were bad people, even if they engaged in human sacrifice, all the arguments for why the Canaanites were bad, I get. But did you have to wipe out the men, women, and children altogether, whether they were guilty or not of these things? Maybe they didn't like, maybe there were some Canaanites who didn't like human sacrifice. I don't know. The point is that archaeologically, historically, we don't have proof it happened. Folks, I've got to run. I want to wish everybody Chag Sameach. It is a Chag today. It is a holiday. It's Shmini Atzeret during the day. And then tonight, we celebrate with Simchat Torah. So if you feel up to it and you want to join us for Simchat Torah, please dance and sing with us for the Torah. Thank you, Rosemary, for reading today. And again, everybody stay healthy. Yeah.
Are we indoors or out tonight?
We're indoors, but we will be streaming, by the way, too. We'll be streaming on our Facebook page. So you don't have to worry about being indoors. You can also be indoors in your own house. Thank you. And thanks for
We'll see you later, Rabbi.
See you later. Take care, everybody. Be good. Be well. Get